So, I'm a Sonic fan, or at least I was. That is a sentiment I'm sure many Sonic fans over the years have held, especially now. But what is a Sonic fan, and what is Sonic? You see, that is where the problem lies. Sonic has gone through so many different renditions and ideas that conflict with one another, to the point where defining him under one banner seems rather futile. Sonic today is in a state. His games are lackluster and underpolished. His character is inconsistent, changing with almost every title, and the franchise seems as a whole afraid of retreading the past. Unfortunately, the past is, as I believe, where Sonic needs to look towards for inspiration. When Sonic started out, his character in games were rather simple. He's a hedgehog with an attitude that goes fast and saves animals. The gameplay was all about rewarding skill with speed, and the thematical message of nature vs industry was intact throughout the game's environment and enemies. People may roll their eyes at this now, but the small act of Sonic tapping his foot impatiently when the player remained idle was a great way of telling the player that Sonic has a mind of his own and you're wasting his time. As the franchise continued, Sonic's world became more fleshed out. We got to meet Tails, introducing cooperative play to the series for the first time, but also deepening our understanding of Sonic. His attitude wasn't about him being egotistical, otherwise he wouldn't have taken Tails along with him. That's Eggman's deal. The classics made a point to show off how he often embellished his creations with his own face. Later on we would see Knuckles, whose home would introduce us to the Master Emerald, showing us that the Chaos Emeralds might have a story of their own to tell. The key thing about these changes is that they were all additive. Gameplay additions never took anything away, but instead enhanced what had came before. With the exception of Sonic CD, which experimented with new abilities and a time travel mechanic, but still retained enough similarities to previous titles to where it was still identifiable as a Sonic game. This is also true narratively. While Sonic's narrative was not a focus at this time, the franchise still acknowledged and built off of past events, creating a nice sense of cohesion for those who noticed. The spin-off games of early Sonic were also highly experimental, a luxury afforded to by their positions as spin-offs. And where titles such as Sonic 3D Blast and Spinball were unique gameplay-wise, thematically they still fit Sonic's identity at the time. A hedgehog running around, saving animals and having a great time whilst doing so. Supplementary media for Sonic in this time, namely the cartoons, worked to flesh out more of Sonic's world to us. Whilst The Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog cartoon focused far more on Sonic goofing around on his planet Mobius, depicted as an incredibly abstract world to a far greater extent than in the games, Sonic Sat AM, as it's referred to by fans, took a more plot-driven focus instead, showing how Dr. Eggman had ruthlessly begun his reign of terror. Now, whilst none of these were canon to games, they still helped articulate the character of Sonic to his audience, showing us his personality, his likes and things like that, as well as showing he was known by others for his deeds. The same naturally goes for Eggman and Tails, as well as their relation to Sonic. In addition to the cartoons, the Archie Sonic comic and the Fleetway Sonic comic also were available, providing much of what the shows did, albeit on the more extreme side of things. Eventually, however, the classic era would come to an end, giving way to the introduction of a properly 3D Sonic, with improved technology but also a change in direction. Sonic Adventure released at the turn of the millennium, the ideas Sonic championed in the past were centered around a specific demographic, which was since dwindling. As a result, the Sonic we meet in Adventure is a bit different from the ones of the classics. For a start, the gameplay being fully 3D meant the way you traversed the world was completely different. But Sega took advantage of this by filling the environment with all sorts of interesting secrets and occurrences, the biggest form of which would be the game's numerous hub worlds. In order to compensate for the larger enemy movement, the developers added the homing attack, to allow players to more easily target foes in a 3D space. However, what was key was that they didn't remove features from past games. Sonic could still regularly bounce into enemies to defeat them and gain height, still had his spin dash, and still needed to master his movement to maintain speed and build momentum. The robots still drop animals when defeated as well. Basically, what I'm saying is that they built off his past whilst making some necessary adjustments for the 3D setting. They also introduced a new character mechanic in the form of character upgrades that both dynamically change the character's appearance whilst also granting them new abilities, typically used to encourage and reward exploration of the 3D space to the player. Narratively, the game picked up from Sonic & Knuckles, the last mainline game at the time, with returning members of the cast occasionally making references to the classics, and even some reimagined locations of the classics make an appearance as well. As for the world setting, we got to see humans other than Eggman for the first time in Sonic games. We see how Sonic's world and the human world are one and the same, just that humans obviously don't live in the wilderness like Sonic does. Lastly but not least, Sonic Adventure also debuts the Chow Garden, a side mode where you raise small creatures you can visit at your leisure during the main game. The Chow are even tied to the story of Sonic Adventure, which really helps them appear connected to the Sonic series, and in my opinion, makes them the most effective tiny animal in the series. Throughout the story of Sonic Adventure, we get to learn about human society, how Sonic and his friends fit into it, the history of the Master Emerald, and why Knuckles is the last of his kind, amongst other things. The stage order is also dictated by the story far more than in the classic games. Adventure was a lot more tied to its plot than its predecessors, but this was a natural evolution for the series. Ever since Sonic 1, the main games were increasingly deepening their narrative, with Sonic 3 and Knuckles having a very apparent plot in contrast to Sonic 1. As the series moved forward, we saw a continued sense of continuity, with Sonic Adventure 2 picking up and expanding on the mechanics of Adventure, which in turn can be traced back to the classic games. Spin-off games were numerous as well, with titles like Sonic Shuffle still filling those unique games, and Sonic Advance taking the new Sonic and fitting it to the gameplay style of the classics. Once we reach Sonic Heroes, however, we reach a rather sudden shift in tone and structure, the likes of which had only really happened in mainline Sonic once before with Sonic CD. Sonic Heroes presented a simpler view of the Sonic games, with clear inspirations from the classics, as well as an obvious goal to appeal to newer, younger audiences. It is with Sonic Heroes where the cracks begin to show. The game has a strange relationship with its narrative. Whilst its plot is presented as existing mainly just to motivate the main cast, returning fans would notice that it still attempts to fit into the established Sonic continuity, suggesting that the plot is not meant to be a throwaway motivational tool for this game. Additionally, the control of Sonic Adventure was widely praised, yet Sonic Heroes wanted to reimagine the platforming style, making player control teams of 3 that each could traverse terrain that others could not. Whilst this change was not additive like the one past, it was not in and of itself a negative one. The control of the characters, however, underwent a more impactful change. Altered from Adventure's character's precision, becoming far more slippery and less responsive to player input. As such, this resulted in a disconnect between what the player wanted and what the character did. It's unclear why Sonic Heroes lacked the precision of the Adventure titles, but the series would never reach that standard again. The series moved on to Shadow the Hedgehog in what felt like a true return to the Sonic continuity from Adventure 2. This game was the most narrative-driven of all Sonic games at that point in time, which, as I mentioned before, makes sense considering that, bar Heroes, the narrative of Sonic was becoming one of its key differentiators from other titles. Interestingly enough, even though this was a mainline title, they chose to follow Shadow as the protagonist. Some did not like this choice, and would even say that Shadow the Hedgehog is a spin-off game. You can see where Sega was coming from when you view the progression of Sonic's plot. At this point in time, Sonic had no unresolved plot threads. Whilst they could have easily just started a new plot as they usually do, they looked to Shadow. Unlike Sonic, Shadow very much had an unfinished story as a result of his abrupt return from the grave in Sonic Heroes that provided many questions and little answers. On top of this, having Shadow as the focus would allow the development team to experiment with concepts they wouldn't dream of pairing with Sonic, such as siding with the villains and using firearms. Shadow the Hedgehog was very experimental and very different from its predecessors. And whilst narratively it aimed to continue from Adventure 2, Due to the nature of its own story progression being centered around choices, the developers would ultimately end up compromising the game's identity by including one true ending at the very end of the game, which many players would never even unlock. The gameplay was similarly unresponsive as Sonic Heroes was, with missions being padded by Team Chaotic-styled objectives from Sonic Heroes. All in all, the game at the time was not well received. Sonic's next main game was intended to restore faith in the franchise, bring a bunch of new players in as well. Considering the reception of Shadows and Heroes, Sega went with the Sonic Adventure-style gameplay for the design of their next project. A situation not too dissimilar from the one they find themselves in now, and a decision I agree with, as the adventure style at this point in time was still most associated with modern Sonic. Everything from the adventure games would be done on a grander scale, except the Chow! The plot would be accentuated by polished HD cutscenes, like none any had seen before. The gameplay would evolve the adventure formula to further bridge the gap between player and character without sacrificing precision, and the music would be given its most dynamic presentation so far. Unfortunately, we all know how this turned out. A rushed and unfinished game that sent the series into its lowest ever point. And that truly pains me to say, as if the game was executed properly, whilst it still would have had some questionable inclusions, the franchise would have continued forward with the status and budget of a AAA title. Alas, Sonic 06 featured the worst version of the adventure gameplay formula, from controlling Sonic, which removed the agility and practicality from staple moves such as the spin dash, all the way down to character selection, which was restricted to 3 Hedgehogs and then randomly switching to their friends sometimes during a level. The narrative was also heavily crippled, mainly the sections revolving around Sonic, who for the majority of the game is repeatedly saving the same princess over and over, not contributing much to the overall plot itself. Sega seems to have taken from Sonic 06's failings that it was not any mismanagement on their behalf, but more the Sonic Adventure formula as a whole that was to blame. Thus, they scrapped it in favour of another experimental game in Sonic Unleashed. Interestingly, they did keep the quality and focus on narrative that Sonic 06 had, likely due to the fact that the narrative evolution of Sonic has always been present in the mainline games. With Unleashed, Sega seemed to learn 2 things. One was that they should stop experimenting in the main games, as they keep getting burned for their new ideas. The other was that the boost gameplay, introduced in Unleashed, was the first gameplay style since Adventure to be received relatively well. Before Sonic's next mainline title, however, another legacy aspect of the series would die off in the next spin-off game, Sonic and the Black Knight. Whilst the game itself was not associated with the mainline Sonic game, its narrative style was at the same standard as Sonic Unleashed. It had numerous high-budget CGI cutscenes, and even when the story was told through pictures, the characters expressed a lot of their emotions and thoughts about the scenario they found themselves in. Sonic Colors was the next mainline title, and its arrival marked the end of an era. Unlike the games prior, Sonic Colors did not place much emphasis on its story, using it more as a motivator for the game's events, like Heroes did. However, unlike Heroes, it doesn't take itself seriously. The game features numerous fourth wall breaks, as well as self-aware jokes that the franchise has never so boldly shown off before. The story is delivered through static conversations in between the game's levels, with nothing coming close to the action of games like Adventure 2, 06, and Unleashed. There is a clear focus on comedy, with Eggman having 2 new robotic henchmen that exist purely for comedic relief, as well as Sonic making more jokes than he usually would, as mentioned before. However, since the game takes its plot less seriously, there's not much of a need for comic relief, and it gets rather annoying quite quickly. Gameplay-wise, Sonic Colors takes inspiration from the daytime sections of the Sonic Unleashed boost formula, but now the levels take place from a mostly 2D perspective, with 3D sections appearing sparsely as a way to connect the 2D sections together. On top of this, Sonic moves far slower when not boosting compared to past games, and the level design is focused more on careful platforming. Unlike the classics, however, This platforming does not allow for building and sustaining momentum. Colors does not use the momentum-based platforming. The result is a very stiff and slow experience that relies on many tropes of the 2D platformer genre rather than using the strengths of the classic Sonic games. Sonic Colors' narrative is also self-contained, which doesn't mean much of anything on its own, but this change foreshadows Sega's new direction for Sonic games. With the played-down narrative and gameplay style that no longer represents the classics in any capacity, Sonic Colors clashes with the previous additive design philosophy, which had admittedly lessened around Unleashed, but has now completely been disregarded. With Sonic Colors being largely regarded as the first good Sonic game in years, Sega would want to maintain this new momentum. As an anniversary title, Sega would harken back to key points of Sonic's past as one big nostalgic love letter to the franchise. This would take form in the game's Sonic Generations. Generations featured levels, items, and characters from Sonic's history, including his classic self. The stages were split into 2 acts, with Act 1 being a fully 2D classic level, and Act 2 being a mostly 2D modern level. Okay, so it was more sold as the boost experience, but my point still stands. A key thing to note is that the stages are grouped into 3 distinct eras, being classic, Dreamcast, and modern, yet the adventure gameplay style is not represented in any way within the game, making it feel like the odd one out compared to the other 2. As for narrative, the game uses it as an excuse for multiple elements of Sonic's past to reappear for the purpose of the game. In other words, it's just a tool with nothing much to say on its own. We get a very limited amount of character interaction, which seems like a waste given the opportunities Generation provides, which is part of a larger change in philosophy behind Sonic at this point in time. New characters being added to the cast was something practically every major Sonic game did in some form, but starting from Unleashed, the Sonic franchise would begin to downplay Sonic's supporting cast in both presence and personality. Sonic Generation really makes this noticeable, for even though the supporting characters are present, they are not playable and do not impact the plot. The motivation for the change can be reasonably assumed as a response to critics at the time, blaming Sonic's failures on part to his ever-growing cast of annoying friends, bogging down the games with tedious gameplay styles and mods, something I very much disagree with. Interestingly, Generations directly references certain events from Sonic's past during the plot. However, I do not think this was the developers returning to the narrative cohesion, and more just adding as many nostalgic references as they could. Now, this is obviously just me making some estimations, but Sega would make another change I disagree with in an attempt to appease their critics. That being to pander to classic nostalgia. It was easy to miss in Colors. Sonic 4 Episode 1 was a low-budget spin-off, and Generations had an excuse for it, so it didn't seem too prevalent. But ever since Sonic Generations, the mainline Sonic games have been filled with an abundance of classic Sonic elements. No clearer is this highlighted than in Sonic Lost World. In Lost World, the ground regained its checkered tiles. Eggman robots were once again powered by tiny animals. Sonic was not only back to freeing the tiny animals from capsules, but now forced the player to save a certain amount to progress through the game. And something I didn't mention earlier is that Sonic's model has been changed to closer resemble his classic self, with shorter quills and limbs. Keeping to the critics, Sonic, Tails, and Dr. Eggman are the only returning characters in the game. Amy and Knuckles appear so briefly they may as well not have, and Eggman's lackeys do not count. Sega also seemed to overcompensate towards classic fans by making the trees of Sonic's world look like they were from Minecraft, a decision that just screams to me how out of touch Sega is with their fanbase. People who like the classics didn't because of pixelated trees, which is something Sonic had never once declared being the way trees look. Gameplay wise, the developers continue to baffle, choosing to throw out their well-received boost formula that was still relatively fresh in favour of an all-new gameplay style. This new way to play was even slower than Sonic Colors, with both 2D and 3D sections being filled with slow platforming areas. Whilst the 3D sections had more going for them than in Colors, they were mostly used to push the new parkour mechanic that was not well received. As for the story, Sonic's Lost World takes place at some new place, located somewhere where 6 very one-note new villains will attempt to defeat Sonic. Throughout the game, we get to see Sonic act as if he was in his 40s, but still trying to pretend he's 18, and Tails developing uncharacteristic insecurities about his friendship with Sonic, as well as acting a little narcissistic. By the end of it, the game does not connect to any of the Sonic story, and its own plot is wrapped up by the ending. It would be a long while until the next proper Sonic game rolled around, but eventually we were graced with the gift that is Sonic Mania, a game that was made by prominent fans in the Sonic community under the supervision of Sega, that aimed to provide a true continuation of the gameplay from Sonic 3 and Knuckles. From sound design to visuals, Mania not only replicated, but updated its source material, including new features such as Sonic's new drop dash ability, whilst also retaining his old moveset as additional options. Now, as far as narrative goes, all we know for sure is the game takes place after Sonic 3 and Knuckles, and that the game introduces the Phantom Ruby for the purpose of the next mainline game. Aside from that, there is not much else, but since the game is going for a classic feel, it doesn't really need much for it to work. Sonic Mania encapsulates the strong qualities of Sonic in general: the standout environments, amazing soundtrack, tight controls, rewarding gameplay, expressive characters, and even some humour in modes such as and Knuckles. Whilst I enjoy this game a lot, it does have a glaring flaw. Only 4 of the stages are original ones, with the rest being reimagined from the classics. Now, whilst these reimagined levels are still excellent, the decision to include so many was from Sega, which shows how rooted they are in nostalgic pondering. The inclusion of Green Hill was especially questionable, seeing as it had already been reimagined recently in both Sonic 4 Episode 1 and Sonic Generations. And finally, this brings us to Sonic Forces, the game that, in my opinion, is the culmination of everything wrong with Sonic. From the poor quality of gameplay, the betrayal of characters' personalities, the mess of a narrative that has total swings every 2 seconds on top of creating some glaring contradictions, to the nostalgia bait in the marketing, the lower budget, and with Sonic as the only playable character as well as being mostly 2D, Sonic Forces has a lot of issues. I think it would make the most sense to start with the nostalgia. As I've mentioned, Sega became very insistent on relying on nostalgia to carry their game amongst critics. Sonic Forces brings back classic Sonic by teleporting him from the ending of Sonic Mania. Green Hill Zone is featured yet again as the first level in the game. Although it has some aesthetical changes, it's still relatively similar. The Death Egg robot, which was also used in Sonic 4, Sonic Mania and Sonic Generations, is mass-produced, and the most egregious of all of the inclusions is of Chaos from Sonic Adventure. An iconic character from a game that has not seen any form of representation outside of Sonic Generations, was prominently featured in the game's marketing, only has one dedicated appearance, in which he is defeated in one hit by classic Sonic. And that's all he gets. No fight whatsoever. The gameplay is nothing to write home about either. Classic Sonic plays the worst he ever has, and that's even if you include games such as Sonic 4 as classic. He is stiff, has awkward acceleration, and lacks any sense of momentum. His stages are by far the worst and least inspired. Even his music is off, being some strange "I'm trying too hard to be retro" music that doesn't even match the style of the classic games. Modern Sonic also isn't a shining star. His boost no longer follows the stage, which can result in unfair deaths. His movement when not going fast in a straight line is unresponsive, and as mentioned before, he spends sections of the levels in 2D, even though classic Sonic is in the game. Oh, and there's a third playable character, the Rookie, who is a player OC. I didn't mention him before because he doesn't add anything to the game besides being a self-insert who's best buds with Sonic. And gameplay wise, he is just Sonic, but with a slower homing attack and a switchable weapon in place of boost. His stages still flip between 3D and 2D. Now, the narrative of Sonic Forces attempts to present itself as a darker and more serious story, in contrast to the light-hearted tone of recent games, something Sonic has managed in the adventure era. However, in Forces they undermine this tone as a result of a lack of impact. For example, Sonic is captured by Eggman and has apparently been tortured for months, but when we next see him, he's making jokes at his captor while smiling. In Sonic Forces, Eggman has taken over the world thanks to his new lackey Infinite, the Phantom Ruby, and Sonic being captured. All of Sonic's allies were absolutely useless in the war against the Eggman Empire, apparently, even though characters like Tails and Knuckles have beaten him on their own before. Now this is a strong premise that rarely gets to be explored. Eggman is on the upper foot, and Sonic must act soon or else all is lost. But instead of exploring the world to see what effects the Eggman occupation has had, or even just seeing what the Sonic cast thought about their current situation, we instead get to focus on the self-insert rookie, Infinite, and classic Sonic. I hope you don't care about anyone else, because you won't be seeing them. Modern Sonic is more used to prop up the self-insert, and Tails is meant to be Classic's best bud since you steal his job. Oh yeah, and they also just retcon Classic from being a younger Sonic into becoming a different dimension of Sonic. As the plot progresses, you do not find out anything relating to Infinite. You only visit a handful of locations, and eventually you beat Eggman thanks to the self-insert being special, with Infinite disappearing and not having any form of resolution. The characters are also nothing like their old selves, with Tails being a great example. At the start of the game, when Sonic is captured, Tails does not step in to help him, and runs away when he's taken by Eggman. We are then told by Silver, which we have no idea how or why he is here, that Tails has lost it over Sonic's death. We then see Tails trying to repair Omega when Chaos Zero sneaks up on him. Now Tails has beaten Chaos 4 and witnessed Sonic beat Perfect Chaos back in Sonic Adventure, so you would think he could handle Chaos, right? Wrong! Instead, Tails crouches down in fear, begging for Sonic, who is thought to be dead, to save him.
Done it! I couldn't figure it out for you, buddy. I'm sorry I wasn't smart enough. Huh? Whoa! Chaos! Sonic, help me!
What? Aside from ruining characters, the logistics of Sonic's world is also ruined in this game. The moon being blown in half back during Adventure 2 was always an oddly absent feature from future games, but Forces makes the whole planet inconsistent. We see the world map in Forces that shows how much percent Eggman owns, but locations we know exist such as Station Square, Angel Island, or the locations from Sonic Unleashed are not present. You might say this game takes place in an alternate universe or something, but to that point I would look towards Chaos, whose presence means Adventure 1 is canon, and as such, Angel Island and Station Square must exist. Additionally, this game acts as if Dr. Eggman is the only human in the Sonic world, likely to pander to classic fans again, even though the classics never claim Eggman is the only human. However, Shadow is still shown to be working as an agent, presumably for Gun, which is a purely human organisation. The game never addresses this, nor any other contradictions. The final kick to the head is that Sonic Forces took around 4 years of development time allegedly. However, it's estimated that 3 of those years are spent working on a new game engine. With that in mind, this game also still recycles models from Sonic Generations and Lost World, such as the sandworms in Green Hill. To summarise, Sonic these days has no sense of continuity with the title that came before it, let alone older games. Characters have been changed and watered down to simple footnotes of who they once were. The gameplay originated from Sega looking for a safe option, and has long since grown stale. The budget for Sonic games has been greatly reduced, giving off the impression that Sega has low expectations for their mascot. In my point of view, if Sega return to the adventure formula, they may be able to not only solve these issues, but enhance the Sonic franchise whilst doing so. But I will go more into that at a later date. This run went on for longer than I had planned, but as much as I wanted to keep this short, there were some things I simply could not skip over. The reason I made this in the first place was to act as a springboard for me to go over individual Sonic characters and allow me to analyse how they've changed from their introductions to present day, but also to highlight my issues of how modern Sonic games have lost touch with what made them so special back in the 2000s. Thank you for watching this video all the way to the end. This is my first time doing something like this. If you think you might be interested in what I have to say about the Sonic cast in the future, then please don't hesitate to subscribe. I hope to see you around.